It was a woman. "All right," he said, to no one in particular. He lifted it gently. It opened on a small brass hinge. He would wait until she woke, and then she was going to explain a great many things. "I'm Caleb Holt," he said. She looked at him with those careful eyes. "I was traveling. My horse spooked and threw me." She paused. "I don't remember much after that." Caleb looked at the horizon. He looked back at her. He looked at Drum. It was on the second afternoon, while he was checking the cloth on her forehead, that the locket slipped from the collar of the clean shirt he'd put on her and swung free on its chain. "What happened to you, Miss Alder?" There were questions coming. He could feel them the way you feel weather, before it arrives, in the particular quality of the air. He lifted her with the careful practicality of a man used to carrying things that couldn't carry themselves, settled her across the saddle, and turned Drum toward home. His brother, Daniel. "You're at my ranch," he said before she could ask. "Found you in the desert, east of the creek bed. Been about 3 days." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You had a head wound and a fever. The doctor's been. You're going to be fine." She lay face down in the red dirt, one arm stretched ahead of her as though she had been crawling when she finally gave out. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her dark hair was matted with dust and something darker. She was not moving, but when Caleb crouched beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her neck, he found a pulse, thin and rapid as a frightened bird. But there, he stood to go. He had his hand on the doorframe when she said, quietly and almost involuntarily, "How did I get here?" He saw the shape in the scrub about 30 yards off the trail. At first he took it for an animal, a deer, maybe, or a coyote that had crawled off to die. He nudged Drum toward it without urgency. What was inside stopped the air in his chest. She woke on the 3rd morning just before dawn, that quiet hour when the desert goes cool and the sky turns the pale color of old bone before the sun decides to remind everyone who's in charge. Caleb was in the chair. He had been sleeping, but he woke when he heard the quality of her breathing change. Lighter, more deliberate, the sleep leaving her. A small portrait, hand-painted, faded at the edges, but unmistakable. A young man with dark eyes and a strong jaw and a scar above his left brow from a fall off a barn roof at 14 years old. A face that Caleb had not seen in 7 years, not since he'd stood in the rain at a churchyard in Colorado and watched a pine box go into the ground. Caleb was not a doctor. He knew what he knew from years of working with injured animals and from a dog-eared medical handbook that had come with the ranch when he bought it from a widow who'd had more sense than her late husband. He cleaned the wound. He kept her temperature down with wet cloths. He got water into her, patiently, a little at a time, the way you water something that's been without too long, slowly, so it doesn't overwhelm. He did not open the locket. Not yet. That would come later, in the way that all the things that change a life come, quietly, when you're not prepared for them, and all at once. She processed this carefully, the way a person processes things when their head has taken damage and the world is still rearranging itself into reliable shapes. "Water," she said, her voice very dry. He sent his ranch hand, a lean and weathered man named Thomas, to ride to the nearest town for the doctor. The doctor came the following morning, declared the wound clean and the fever manageable, and said what Caleb had already suspected. She'd be all right, if she was strong enough. The waiting was the hard part. He heard the faintest sound behind him. Not quite a laugh, not quite a breath. Something between the two. He went to the kitchen and stood at the window and looked at the desert for a while, thinking about the locket and the portrait and the 7 years he'd been carrying Daniel's absence like a stone in his chest that had never gotten lighter. Caleb was used to waiting. He went about his work, the fences, the horses, the 100 small repairs a ranch constantly demanded, and checked on her every few hours with the same methodical attention he gave everything that required keeping alive. "I carried you," he said without turning. You weren't in a state to argue about it. He noticed it the way he'd noticed it the first time, an instinctive awareness, something his eyes moved to before his mind told them to. It was a woman's locket, old, oval, silver with a fine engraved pattern worn smooth by years of handling. The kind of thing kept close because it mattered. Her name, he would learn eventually, was Nora. But for the first 2 days she was simply the woman, feverish, unconscious, occasionally murmuring things he couldn't make out in the narrow back room that had been his mother's sewing room before it became a storage space, and now, through the particular logic of necessity, a sick room. "All right," he said. "Rest. I'll bring you something to eat when you're ready." He was riding the eastern fence line on a Thursday morning in late August when the heat was already unreasonable and the sky had gone that flat white color that meant no relief was coming. His horse, a steady sorrel named Drum, slowed without being told, a small hesitation that Caleb had learned over years to take seriously. Drum didn't hesitate without reason. He gave her the cup he'd had ready on the side table. She drank slowly. Good. She knew not to rush it. The desert didn't offer second chances. Caleb Holt had learned that the way most men in the territory learned things, the hard way, with enough loss behind him to fill a dry riverbed. At 41, he ran his ranch the way he ran himself, quietly, efficiently, and without expecting much from either the land or the people on it. He had a good horse, a reliable rifle, a barn that didn't leak anymore, and a silence around him that most people respected without being asked to. He turned her over carefully. Her face was pale beneath the sunburn, her lips cracked and dry, her breathing shallow. She looked to be in her late 20s or early 30s. There was a wound along her left temple. Not deep, but enough to have bled considerably. Around her neck, on a thin silver chain, hung a small oval locket, warm from the sun. A pause. Something crossed her face, too brief to read, but there. "Nora," she said. "Nora Alder." Caleb sat back in the chair beside the bed and held the open locket in his palm and stared at it for a very long time. Outside, the desert heat pressed against the walls of the house. The woman in the bed breathed steadily, unknowing. The portrait looked back at him with those dark, painted eyes and said nothing, the way Daniel had always had a gift for saying nothing exactly when it mattered most. She looked at the ceiling first, then at the room, then at him. It was a plausible story. It was also, he felt, with the quiet instinct of a man who'd had cause to learn what people looked like when they were telling a partial truth, not the whole one. Her eyes opened slowly. They were gray-green, he noticed, cautious, the eyes of someone who had learned not to show surprise. He let it sit. There was time. She was in no condition to go anywhere, and the questions he had were not the kind that benefited from being asked all at once. Caleb closed the locket carefully and set it back where it had rested against her collarbone. Texto Potter. They talked for a long time that afternoon. The sun moved across the floor of the room in its slow, deliberate way, and neither of them paid it much attention. Nora told her story the way people tell things they've been carrying alone for a while. Carefully at first, then with more weight, as though the telling itself was a relief they hadn't known they needed. She had met Daniel Holt in a mining town in Colorado in the autumn of 1869. He had been working a claim, which she now understood hadn't been his only occupation at the time. He had been charming and serious in equal measure, funny in the private way that takes time to notice, and kind in the specific way of someone who'd learned that kindness cost less than its absence. They had married quietly. 2 years of modest happiness in a small house on the edge of a small town, the kind of happiness that doesn't make stories, but sustains lives. Then things had changed. She didn't yet say how, and Daniel had grown distant, watchful, frightened in a way he wouldn't explain. He'd told her to go to her sister's in New Mexico. She'd argued. He'd asked her finally, just to go. She had gone. A month later, word reached her that he was dead. The man who brought word said it was an accident, Nora said. I had no reason to disbelieve it then. She paused. I have more reason now. Caleb looked at her carefully. What do you mean? I mean that 3 weeks ago, the same man who told me Daniel died came to my sister's house. And the things he said, the questions he asked about Daniel, about whether Daniel had left anything with me, given me anything to keep. They weren't the questions of a man delivering old condolences. She held his gaze. They were the questions of a man who was looking for something. The room felt different now. Caleb set the locket on the side table between them. And the fall from the horse? He said. A pause. I was running from him. Caleb sat with that for a moment. The desert outside was turning amber with late afternoon light. Somewhere in the barn, Drum was moving in his stall. What is he looking for? Caleb asked. I don't know, Nora said, but Daniel did. She looked at the locket. And I think before he died, he was trying to find a way to tell someone, to warn someone. She looked back at Caleb. I think he was trying to find you. Caleb didn't sleep well that night. He lay in the dark and listened to the sounds the desert made, the wind, the occasional distant cry of something hunting, the particular silence that sits underneath all those sounds. And thought about Daniel. The last time he had seen his brother alive, they had not parted well. There had been a disagreement, long-standing, the kind that had roots going back years before it had a name, about money and choices and a piece of land that their father had left to both of them and that Caleb had wanted to keep and Daniel had needed to sell. The words said that day had been the kind that can't be unsaid. Daniel had left. Caleb had stayed. Months passed, then a year, then more, and neither of them had written first, and then the letter came from Colorado saying there was nothing left to write to. He had grieved in the way that men who haven't resolved things grieve, not cleanly, not with closure, but with the persistent ache of a conversation that would now never happen. He had carried the unfinished business of Daniel the way he carried everything, silently, and in the place where he kept things he had no other place for. And now there was a woman asleep in his back room who had been Daniel's wife, who had walked the house Daniel lived in, sat at the table Daniel ate at, known the version of his brother that Caleb had never been allowed to know. It was a particular, strange kind of grief. Not new loss, but the sudden expansion of an old one. In the morning he found her already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She looked slightly startled when he appeared, then settled. I've been thinking, she said. So have I. Whoever is looking for what Daniel left, he'll find me here eventually. She looked at him steadily. I don't want to bring trouble to your home. I can leave as soon as I'm able. You're not able yet. A few more days and… Nora! He said her name for the first time, and it sounded different in the room than he expected. More present somehow. Sit. Drink your coffee. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Daniel was my brother. Whatever he was into, whatever someone is looking for, that's my concern as much as yours. Probably more. He picked up his own cup. So we're going to figure this out together, unless you have a strong objection. She looked at him for a long, assessing moment. Then, he said you were stubborn. Caleb stared at her. Then, for the first time in a very long time, something that was almost a smile crossed his face. He would know, he said. The man's name, Nora told him, was Aldous Crane. He had been Daniel's employer, then his partner, then, in the way of men like Crane, she suspected, his trap. Daniel had worked as a surveyor, which was true, and also as a finder of certain things that other people wanted found, which was considerably less clean. Crane had recruited him for the latter. For a time, Daniel had complied. Then something had changed. A job that went wrong, or a line that Crane had asked him to cross that Daniel wouldn't cross, or simply the moment when a man looks at the thing he's become and decides to become something else. He took something, Nora said. From Crane. Something that Crane needed back. I don't know what it was. Daniel never told me, which I think was to protect me." She paused. "But I think he hid it. I think he hid it somewhere, and I think he was trying to get word to you before Crane found him." Caleb turned this over carefully. "What makes you think he was trying to reach me?" "Because the last letter he sent me, 2 days before he died, mentioned a ranch in New Mexico. He said if anything happened, there was someone there who would understand what to do." She looked at him. "You're the only person it could mean." Caleb stood and went to the window. The morning light was already harsh and direct, throwing hard shadows from every post and stone. "He didn't write me," Caleb said. "Nothing came. It might not have reached you, or Crane might have intercepted it." She paused. "Or it might still be coming." The idea settled over the room like a change in temperature. Somewhere in the chain of 7 silent years, his brother had looked for him, had wanted to find him, had been, in whatever complicated and imperfect way Daniel did everything, trying to make something right. Caleb turned back from the window. "This Crane," he said. "What does he look like?" Nora described him. Middle-aged, well-dressed in a way that was always slightly too deliberate, the manner of a man who had money but had come to it through channels that required him to always look like he hadn't. One detail stood out: a ring on his right hand, large turquoise set in silver. The kind of thing you remembered. Caleb nodded slowly. "He'll come here," he said. "Yes, then we should be ready." He looked at her directly. "Can you ride?" "I can ride," she said simply, in the tone of a woman who had answered that question before and found it slightly insulting. The letter arrived 4 days later, as though it had been waiting for exactly the right moment, which was the kind of thing Daniel would have arranged had he been able to arrange it. It came in the regular post, forwarded twice from a town in Colorado to a town in Arizona, to a post rider who delivered rural routes, and handed it to Thomas on a Thursday morning with no particular ceremony. It was addressed to Caleb Holt. In handwriting, he recognized immediately the way you recognize certain things, not by thinking, but by the part of the body that remembers before the mind catches up. He read it alone, sitting at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the east window. Daniel wrote the way he had always spoken, plainly and directly, without flourish, as though the words were something to be used rather than displayed. He wrote about Crane. He wrote about what he had taken, not in detail, but in enough specificity that Caleb understood. A ledger containing records of transactions that would expose Crane and several of his associates to federal scrutiny. Daniel had taken it as insurance, as a means of securing his own freedom from the arrangement, and had hidden it in a place he described in terms that were deliberately oblique, referencing something only the 2 Holt brothers would know. The old water tank, Caleb thought immediately. The one on their father's property that he and Daniel had used as a hiding place for things from the time they were boys. Bicycle parts, once a stray dog they were nursing back to health, a summer's worth of small secrets. But their father's property had been sold. It was in Colorado, and there was no telling what had become of it. The letter ended in a way that stayed with Caleb long after he'd set it down. "I've been a poor brother, Cal. I know that. I've owed you an apology for a long time, and I'm sorry it's coming this way. You were right about the land. You were right about a lot of things. I'm sorry it took me until now to say it. Take care of yourself." He folded the letter carefully. He sat with it for a while. Then he went to find Nora. She was in the yard with Thomas, stronger now, moving with the fluid ease of someone whose body was making up lost ground. When she saw his face, she stopped. "He wrote," she said, not a question. "He wrote." He handed her the letter. He watched her read it, watched her face go through things that were, he realized, both the same as what he'd felt and entirely different. Different in the way that 2 people can lose the same person and grieve entirely separate versions of them. When she finished, she folded it exactly as he had. There was something in that small, mirrored detail that neither of them commented on. "The hiding place he describes," she said. "You know where it is?" "I think I do." He looked toward the horizon. "It's going to require a trip to Colorado." A silence. Then, "When do we leave?" They rode north together through a country that was changing under them. The flat red desert giving way to scrub and then to higher ground. The air shifting in texture and temperature with the elevation. The sky taking on the deeper blue that belonged to altitude. They traveled steady days and made camp at dusk, and the miles between them and the ranch became the kind of distance that either separates people further or makes them honest. It made them honest. Somewhere on the second evening, with the fire burning low and the coyotes doing their distant commentary on the night, Nora told him about the years with Daniel. The good ones, the complicated middle ones. The last year when she'd understood that something was wrong without understanding what. She spoke without self-pity and without accusation, which Caleb recognized as the particular quality of someone who had processed their grief into something workable. In turn, he told her about the argument, about the land, about the years of silence that he'd convinced himself he had wanted and had slowly understood he hadn't. About the moment the letter came from Colorado and the way it had altered something fundamental in him, not broken him exactly, but changed the shape of the space he moved through. "He used to talk about you," Nora said on the third morning while they were breaking camp. "Not often, but when he did, it was clear." She paused, rolling a blanket with practiced hands. "He was proud of you. He just didn't know how to say it to your face." Caleb was quiet with that for a while. "He was Daniel," he finally said, which was not quite an answer, but was also, in the way of things between brothers, entirely sufficient. They reached the old Holt property on the fourth day. It had been bought by a cattle operation, and the house had been expanded and the land rearranged, but the far corner of the north pasture was largely unchanged, and the old water tank stood where it always had. Rusted now, tilted slightly to one side, but present in the way that certain things persist long after their usefulness has ended, out of sheer structural stubbornness. Caleb found the ledger in 40 minutes. It was in an oilskin wrapper, sealed twice, tucked in a cavity in the tank's foundation that had been there since before he was born. He held it in both hands and looked at it and thought about all the things it had traveled through to land here. Daniel's hands, years of hiding, a man's death, a woman crossing a desert on a failing horse, a locket on a silver chain. He handed it to Nora. She held it carefully. "This is enough to bring Crane down," she said. "It should be." She looked at him. "What do you want to do with it?" Caleb looked at the old tank, at the faded paint on the property fence, at the sky that was his brother's sky and his own, and the same one that stretched all the way back to New Mexico without interruption. "I know a federal marshal in Santa Fe," he said. "Honest man, old enough to be stubborn about it." He paused. "We take it to him, we tell him everything, and then we let the law do what it's supposed to do." Nora nodded slowly. "And Crane?" "Crane is going to find out that whatever he was looking for has been found by someone he didn't account for." He said it quietly and without drama, which was, she was coming to understand, how Caleb Holt said everything that was serious.